Today's hearing is about the need for tax reform and what lessons we can learn from the Tax Reform Act of 1986, the last successful overhaul of the United States tax code. We have before us today two former senators who were key to that effort. I don't know why they call you former senators. I think you're always going to be senators to me. I look forward to hearing their thoughts and advice, and I think we all do, during today's hearing. Before we engage meaningfully in tax reform, we need a clear vision of what we want success to look like. A vision is not a specific system of rates, deductions, or credits. Instead, a vision is how we want to change the opportunities for American families and the rewards that Americans receive from their labor, entrepreneurship, and investment. A successfully reformed tax system will help make America the best place in the world to work, conduct business, invest, and prosper. A successfully reformed tax system will be one that provides economic growth and is simple and fair. This, more than anything else, should be our vision for tax reform. The landmark Tax Reform Act of 1986 was developed by then-Chairman Bob Packwood through a careful and methodical bipartisan process that relied heavily on member input. Senator Bradley was a key part of that process. I don't want to leave out Congressman Rostenkowski and a whole raft of others in the White House at that time, but these two are the two great leaders in the Senate at the time. Over the last few weeks, we've begun a similar process that we hope will yield a similar result, tax reform legislation that both parties can support. The 1986 Act, signed into law by President Reagan, reformed a costly and complicated tax system into a simpler one with lower tax rates for American households and businesses, affording them greater personal prosperity. Over time, our tax system has once again become costly, complex, it's impeding growth, standing in the way of shared prosperity, and placing American workers and businesses at a distinct disadvantage. Put simply, it is past time for Congress to stand up once again to fix our broken tax system. If you've been around Washington over the last few years, chances are you've already heard me talk about tax reform. I've been making the case for tax reform on the Senate floor, here in the Finance Committee, in public appearances, in written materials, and in private conversations. In December, the Republican staff of this committee produced a comprehensive report outlining the need for tax reform and providing some direction to our overall efforts. I'm sure everyone here has read that report cover to cover. I've already publicly laid out 7 principles that I believe should guide our tax reform efforts. I will not go into much detail on each principle today. Instead, I'll just talk about them briefly. The first principle is economic growth. Tax reform, if it's done correctly, should promote growth and significantly reduce economic distortions that are present under the current income tax system. The second principle is fairness. The income tax base, which has become riddled with exclusions, exemptions, deductions, and credits, should be as broad as possible. Tax reform should broaden the tax base by eliminating or reducing a number of tax expenditures along with lowering tax rates and removing distortions. The third principle is simplicity. Taxpayers and businesses spend over 6 billion hours a year complying with tax filing requirements, with annual compliance costs in excess of $171 billion, which is more than the gross domestic product of New Zealand, for instance. Simplifying the tax code will result in greater clarity and compliance and will free up resources for families, job creation, and other productive uses. The fourth principle is revenue neutrality. Tax reform should be revenue neutral and not an occasion to raise taxes on American households or businesses. Federal revenues already exceed their historic average as a share of our economy, and greater revenue should not be an objective of reform. The fifth principle is permanence. The Joint Committee on Taxation lists almost 100 provisions in the tax code that will expire over the next decade. This is unacceptable. Families and businesses should be able to plan for the future without wondering if the tax code is going to change from year to year. The sixth principle is competitiveness. The combination of a high corporate tax rate, worldwide taxation, and the temporary nature of some tax incentives makes American companies less competitive when compared to their foreign counterparts. Tax reform should reduce burdens on businesses, large and small, to allow them to more effectively compete on the world stage. The seventh principle is the promotion of savings and investment. Many aspects of our current tax system discourage savings and investment, thereby hindering long-term growth. Savings and investment help build the capital stock, providing fuel for economic growth that generates prosperity for American workers and businesses. These 7 principles are the guideposts I will use when looking at tax reform proposals. I think we're going to have an interesting hearing today. We have 2 really great former leaders, Chairman Packwood and Senator Bradley, to see what advice they can give us as we undertake our tax reform efforts in this Congress. I did read Showdown at Gucci Gulch, and it gave some indication as to how difficult this really was. If anything, it may be even more difficult today because of the messes that have occurred since, none of which you deserve to be blamed for. Senator Wyden?
Thank you very much, Chairman Hatch. As Chairman Hatch noted, the Finance Committee is joined this morning by 2 legislators who were at the heart of the last major overhaul of the U.S. tax code in 1986. Chairman Packwood spent more time than anyone figuring out how to make the numbers in tax reform work. That is the tough work of legislating. Senator Bill Bradley was the intellectual godfather of the reform plan that broadened the base, closed loopholes, and kept progressivity in the code. Senator Bradley lit the fire that got the Reagan administration invested in reform. And I don't think anyone would question my judgment that Senator Bradley had, by a wide margin, the best jump shot in the Senate tall guy caucus. Now, if there's one obvious similarity between 1986 and today, it's that people are quick to say that tax reform is absolutely impossible. Americans say Congress can't organize a 2-car parade. There's no way they can come together on major economic legislation. So what happened 3 decades ago needs to happen again, turning the impossible into the possible. The Congress and President Reagan came together to pass the 1986 Tax Reform Act based on what I called principled bipartisanship. One side wanted to flatten the tax code. The other side wanted to close loopholes and guarantee that the tax code treated everyone fairly. Both sides said, we're going to set aside the partisan attacks, look for common ground, and each side came away with the feeling that it had upheld its principles. When President Reagan signed the bill into law, he called it an historic overhaul of our tax code and a sweeping victory for fairness. He continued, and I quote here, it's also the best anti-poverty program, the best pro-family measure, and the best job creation program ever to come out of the Congress of the United States. Those same objectives ought to guide the Finance Committee and the Congress as it works again to modernize our tax system. Reforming the tax code is always a Herculean task, but the same strategy of principled bipartisanship can work once again. The Congress can turn the impossible into the possible. However, policymakers need to recognize that the process is going to look different. Not every part of a 30-year-old game plan for tax reform can work today. China and India are now superpowers in the global economy, which is a much bigger factor in the tax reform debate. The gulf between wage earners and the top of the income ladder has widened, and America is at its best when a rising tide lifts all the boats, and it should be obvious that making that a reality once again is going to take some hard work. The status of the middle class in Oregon and across America is at the top of the list of compelling issues for tax reform to address. It's fundamentally unfair that a middle-class wage earner could pay a higher tax rate than an affluent person whose earnings come entirely from investments. The tax code should not be used to punish the wage earner in America. And many tax incentives for college education and retirement savings are simply out of whack. The support those incentives provide don't always get to those who need them the most, and that ought to change. Another challenge is making America more competitive in the global economy. Today, you often look and come away saying our country is trying to win a road race in a 30-year-old car. Our competition, meanwhile, trades up to more efficient models. America hasn't done enough to drive innovation at home, and worse, the tax provisions for research and development expire year after year. In 1986, there wasn't a lot of talk about the tax code, for example, and a clean energy future for our country. That's something else that has to change this time. And finally, modernizing our tax code has to be done in a fiscally responsible fashion. Tax reform cannot become an exercise in slashing rates at any cost. The biggest lesson from 1986 is that tax reform is possible when Democrats and Republicans set partisanship aside, come together, and focus on shared principles. Over the years, I've talked frequently with Senator Bradley about how tax reform is always totally, completely, and thoroughly impossible until that moment when it happens. The Finance Committee today has two experienced, knowledgeable witnesses who are going to help us get closer to that point today. Chairman Hatch, thank you, and I look forward to our witnesses.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
if I may have a point of privilege just for a moment, and I thank the chair very much. I am in a intelligence briefing on Iran, but I wanted to come to join the committee and its leadership in welcoming the most outstanding United States Senator New Jersey has ever had to represent it. Not only is he have a great ability to shoot a three-point shot effortlessly, but the intellect that Bill Bradley possesses and his willingness to pass the ball to fellow teammates made him a consummate successful United States Senator here in New Jersey. So I've read his testimony. I look forward to the Q&A so we can engage in some of it, and I appreciate him and Senator Packwood joining us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator. I think that was a pretty good outline of our senator. Our first witness is Bob Packwood. Senator Packwood was first elected to the U.S. Senate in 1968 and served the people of Oregon in this body for 26 years. He was chairman of the Finance Committee from 1985 to 1987 and presided over this committee's efforts to draft and pass the Tax Reform Act of 1986. He made a pivotal difference in this, as did our other witness. He also served as chairman of the Commerce Committee for 4 years. And prior to his time in the Senate, Senator Packwood practiced law in Portland, Oregon for 10 years, was elected to serve for 3 terms in the Oregon State Legislature. He received a bachelor's degree in political science from Willamette University. Willamette, I guess. I've got to pronounce that a little bit better, don't I? And in Portland, Oregon, and a law degree from New York University Law School. We feel honored to have you here today. We know you can help us in many ways to understand some of the difficulties we're going to have to get through, and hopefully give us some advice on how to get through. Our second witness is another great human being who I greatly admire and admired before he came to the Senate. That's Senator Bill Bradley. Senator Bradley represented the people of New Jersey here in the Senate for 3 terms, beginning in 1979. And as a member of the Senate Finance Committee, he played a pivotal role in the drafting and passage of the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Of course, prior to his time in the Senate, Senator Bradley was a great professional basketball player. He's a 2-time NBA champion and a member of the Basketball Hall of Fame. Senator Bradley holds a bachelor's degree in American history from Princeton University and a master's degree from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He is the author of 7 books on American politics, culture, and economy, and currently hosts American Voices, a radio show highlighting the remarkable accomplishments of both famous and unknown Americans. We welcome you, Senator Bradley, as well. We thank both of you for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Senator Packwood, you go first.
And Senator Bradley also holds the record for the most points ever scored in the basketball playoff in Portland, Oregon, when he scored, what, 64 points? 58. Mr. Chairman, when I was contacted, everyone asked, how did you do it in '86, and are there any parallels till today? There are some, but the circumstances were different. In our era, fairness was the issue, not income inequality. In the next to the last page of my statement, you will see a list of newspaper stories about people that paid no taxes at all. Industries, defense industries, at the time of the Reagan buildup, that not only paid no taxes, they got money back. And the public and the members of Congress could not understand how wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals could pay nothing. It wasn't fair. So that was the premise we were operating under at the time. You will find in, you'll find in my statement, on occasion, the word diary. That means that was taken specifically from my diary at the time. Now, what happened? First, tax reform is not a new idea. Stanley Surrey, who was President Kennedy's Assistant Treasury Secretary for Tax, came up with the idea of tax expenditures. You can lower taxes if you get rid of them. Bill Bradley and Dick Gephardt in their Fair Tax said the same thing. Studies Treasury 1 and Treasury 2, all the same thing. We all knew how it worked. We all knew that you could lower the rates if you could get rid of deductions. It was just pure mathematics. The House had public hearings for a year in 1985, and they had a lot of individual votes on things as they went along. And they picked up enemies. They picked up barnacles because some of those interests lost their votes. And there's lots of single issue groups. And I don't mean NRA or Right to Life, but you touch mortgage interest and you've got the realtors. You touch inside buildup and you've got insurance. You touch 501c3 charitable contributions, you've got every organization in the country opposed. And the problem with the House bill is that they had enough of these barnacles attached to the bill when it finally came out of committee that the votes were not there on the floor to pass it. It would have failed but for the fact that Ronald Reagan literally came up on the Hill, met with the Republicans and say, please vote for this bill. I will veto it if it passes in this form, but send it to the Senate and see what they can do. With that, enough Republicans changed their vote, and the bill passed, although you'd never know if they changed their vote because it passed on a voice vote in the House. Comes to the Senate, and in those days, the Senate didn't get going as quickly as you've gotten going now. We didn't get going till mid-February or March. I finally started having some hearings on this bill, but we didn't need many hearings because in the summer of 1985, we'd had about 30 hearings on the subject of tax reform, just in case the House would pass something. Because if they passed it, I knew we'd have to act relatively quickly, and I didn't want to have a lot of hearings at the same time. So we pretty much cleared the deck of hearings. But there's one thing that caught my mind at the time of the hearings. And I would ask witnesses, how low would the tax rate have to be before you didn't care whether there's any deductions? No, 30%, 20%, 25%. It was always in that range. I didn't think much about a time, but I was intrigued with almost every witness I would ask. That's what I would get. Well, all right, we come to the spring of 1986. I'm frankly making no progress in committee. We're not making the bill any better. We're not making it any worse. We just aren't getting any place. So on Friday, April 18th, I simply adjourned the committee and said, we're done with the bill. And somebody said, you mean we're done for the day? I said, no, we're done with the bill. This is the end of this bill. And at that stage, I called them, and this is where things move so rapidly. I called David Brockway, who was then the chief of the Joint Tax Committee, and said, give me three bills, 25, 26, 27% high. He says, 25%, you'll have to get rid of mortgage interest. And Bill, I remember you saying how much trouble mortgage interest gave you on your bill. So I asked him, what about 26%? That's Friday. The following Tuesday, he comes and he gives me three, not bills, they weren't in bill form, but three plans as to how you could get to 25, 26, 27%. And I looked at them, and then I was delayed for 2.5 days because at this stage, up came fast track for the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. It's one of those things where the president can't move unless you give him fast track authority. And there was a deadline. If Congress had not acted by, this was Tuesday, the next Wednesday at midnight, he got it. The House had not acted. It fell on our side to take care of it. I thought it was a slam dunk. I was sure we were there Turns out I didn't have the votes. I was missing one, and it was Sparky Matsunaga, who was mad from Hawaii that the president had not answered his letter on macadamia nuts. And I had to get over that hurdle and bring him around. We finally succeeded in doing it, but it was Thursday before I was done. Then on Thursday, I present to the committees at the same time, to our committee, just the outlines. We have no bill. Just the outlines of what might be possible. And they seemed to like that. So I thought to myself, the meeting's over, and I'm getting toward the weekend, and I'm thinking at this stage, how are we going to do this? And I thought the only way it can be done is bipartisan, quickly, and behind closed doors. The bipartisan, because I could see any bill that was utterly partisan on the Republican side would have no success with the House conference. Any bill that was not done quickly but hung out like the House bill did would pick up enemies all along the way. And it would have to be done behind closed doors. It was helpful to have the president on board at the start. It wasn't critical, but it was helpful to have him basically tilting the same way we were going to go in the Senate. On that weekend, on Saturday and Sunday, I called 6 senators: Bill Bradley, George Mitchell, Pat Moynihan, Jack Danforth, John Chafee, and Malcolm Wallop. And I said, would you be willing to meet in my office starting next Tuesday at 8:30 to see if we can work out a bill that will be satisfactory to us and the president? Every one of them said yes. And now pass, starting that Tuesday, the most extraordinary experience in my life in politics. We met from Tuesday to Tuesday. Bill was at every meeting. In fact, they were all at every meeting. Every morning at 8:30, I'd meet with staff at 7:30, this core group, a cabal as I called it, at 8:30, and we'd work out what we thought should be in the bill. We had 1 or 2 open committee meetings, but basically the committee was just marking time, waiting for us to finish. And you could tell, although the meetings were behind closed doors, there's no secrets in this town. And the word was getting out we were having the meetings, but no one exactly knew what it is we were doing. But on the Thursday between these 2 Tuesdays came a phone call that became very important in this whole process. And I will read it to you because it's from the diary. Back again to tax reform in closed session was interrupted by a phone call from Danny Rostenkowski. Bless his soul, he said, "Pal, I've been thinking of coming over there and without fanfare, without press, just to say I've been through it. I know every day you go through troughs and onhills, and I've been bleeding for you. But I think what you've got in terms of tax reform is the best thing Congress has seen in 10 years. You get this through the Senate. And between the two of us, we're going to put out a bill that for a generation of Americans will look like a pinnacle." God, I appreciated it. What he was saying, what the Ways and Means Committee chairman is saying, write this bill in the Senate, which Ways and Means doesn't say very often. We continued our meetings through Friday, and then we had a public meeting Friday afternoon, and I said to everybody, we're done, and we're not going to meet this weekend. By this time, the hallway is packed with lobbyists. We have speakers out there. Committee, we're done. We're not meeting at all this weekend. Cheers and huzzahs. And then I said to the core group, but we will meet tomorrow. Bill had already planned, you went to Kentucky that night for a speech, canceled the Kentucky Derby, and came back to be with us the next day. On that Saturday, the 7 of us met all day from about 8:30 to around 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon, and that tied up all the last of the things we needed. Joint tax needed a couple days to get it together, but they would have it for us Monday or Tuesday, and we were ready to go on Tuesday night until I finally had to make an odious deal with the oilies to get their support, not in committee. We could have beaten them in committee. But to get their support for something we needed desperately on the floor, and if we lost this particular issue on the floor, the bill was dead. And that was it. We vote that night. Most of the committee had not ever seen the whole outline of the bill or the whole bill until that night. And so from Tuesday to Tuesday, the 7 of us work. That night, the bill is adopted 20-0. Now, can you do the same thing now in this committee? Here are the things that would be critical. It's helpful to have the president on board, to have him with you from the start. But at a minimum, you've got to make sure that he's not against you or gives the impression that he's not sure if he's going to vote for it or he has some questions, because you're not going to get your members to take tough votes on things that the president might veto if you put them in a bill. So he, at a minimum, he must say, I'm open, send me a good bill. 2, I think you're going to have to do it in much the same way we did, which is behind closed doors, but that's not uncommon in the House and the Senate even today. Behind closed doors, and try to do it quickly and present it in one grand bill. We did it combining both corporate and individual into one bill, and then use the money we raised from them and do lower tax bills for everybody else. If you look on the last page of your statement, you'll see who the major groups were we hit. It was almost all corporations and rich individuals. And do it in one bill so that people don't have to pick out a particular thing that they don't like and are forced to vote on it. You give them this, you give them the whole bill, and I think they'll go for it. And so that's what we succeeded in doing, and believe it or not, hitting business as hard as we did, raising their taxes about $140 billion, we managed to lower the corporate rates from 48 to 34%, lower the individual rates from 50 to 27%, and keep the bill revenue neutral. You can do it. But Orrin and Ron, the 2 of you, are going to have to make an agreement as to what we're trying to get. And the thing I like about the fact that it's 2 of you doing it, Ron, you may recall about 10 years ago we ran into each other in the dry cleaners. And you were working on tax reform then. And I know, Orrin, you've crossed party lines many times. I remember you working with Ted Kennedy on things. You both show a willingness to work across party lines on some occasions when it didn't please your parties too much. So it can be done, but it can only be done if the majority and the minority at the start are on the same page. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating. We're very appreciative to have that overview. Senator Bradley, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Senator Packwood. He's an extraordinary leader, and he ran the committee with great effectiveness, not only on tax reform, but on a whole series of other issues. This is also a first for me. This is the first time I've been in this room since December 1996. I notice it hasn't changed. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to give a few thoughts about structure and make amplification on 2 things that Senator Packwood said. First, what is the ideal income tax system? I believe the ideal income tax system is a system that provides the greatest number of people the lowest rate. And in terms of principles, and these were the principles that I think we used in 1986 to determine what it was in, what was out. One was efficiency. It's a basic threshold question for members of the Finance Committee. And the efficiency point is, I believe the market's a more efficient allocator of resources than is a member of the Ways and Means Committee or the Finance Committee. So that was one principle. The second principle is an equity question, horizontal equity. Equal incomes should pay equal taxes, not somebody have the same income and next door somebody who's using loopholes reduce their tax rate. Third is fairness, which is essentially vertical equity, and that is those who have more should pay more. In other words, the progressive nature of the system. And fourth, do whatever you can to make the system less complex We live in a time where few people fill out their returns and where tax fraud is estimated to be nearly $80 to $100 billion. So those are the principles: efficiency, equity, fairness, simplicity. And you measure everything against those principles. Now, what do you need to pass tax reform? Drawing on our experience, I think you need at least 6 things. The first thing you need is the exact thing President Packwood said. You need a president who is going to put his prestige and clout on the line to drive things through when the inevitable obstacles appear. Second, you need a Treasury Secretary who is the President's designee to deal with it every day. And you need a Treasury Secretary who has an incredible person who constantly monitors that. Of course, in 1986, the President was Ronald Reagan, and his Secretary of Treasury was Jim Baker, and his assistant was Dick Darman, all of whom played critical roles in this. And I can't tell you how important it is to have a Treasury Secretary who can speak for the President, so I didn't have to run back to the White House all the time to check this or check that. And in fact, as Bob remembers, we got down to the critical strokes at the end of this process. There was some difference of opinion, and Jim Baker was in the room doing the negotiating because he knew enough of the substance and had paid attention to it. I remember him convening a meeting during the period when there was Treasury 1 and Treasury 2, which were things that Ronald Reagan tasked the Treasury Department to do. And he convened a meeting with Jack Kemp at his house and me and I think Bob or a few other people. I think it's important to know the longer-term journey of tax reform. When I came, one of the reasons I ran for the Senate was I wanted to reform the income tax system. I remember reading an article by Milton Friedman many years before when I was a basketball player about how you could have a tax system with 16%, and I thought that's pretty interesting. And I've read all of Stanley Surrey from Harvard, Joe Peckman at Brookings. And I remember in 1984, I went to Walter Mondale, who was the candidate for president of the Democrats, and tried to convince him to do tax reform. I said it could take the issue from the Republicans. They were out there talking about tax cuts. Here you could talk tax cuts and equity. He had been a member of the Finance Committee, and Charlie Rangel was his advisor on this issue, and I think the combination of those things made him unwilling to take what he thought was the big risk for a hopeless cause. And so it passed. However, as everything in politics, nothing's secret, it leaked that maybe Mondale would be doing tax reform. And so that's when Ronald Reagan, in the middle of the campaign, called for a study by the Treasury Department, which was Treasury 1. And it so happened that the people at the Treasury Department in the tax area were really great people. And so they took the charge seriously. And they produced a document that was an outstanding document laying out the boundaries and the parameters and the specifics of what tax reform is. Naturally, when you threw it out there, as I had experienced when I threw out the Bradley-Gephardt bill in '82, you throw something out specific and everybody chews on it. So everybody chewed on Treasury 1 and how terrible this is and how terrible that is. And you ended up having Treasury 2. And Treasury 2 accommodated some of those interests, stiff-armed others, but it was an improvement over Treasury 1. And so that's how the Treasury Department got involved. And you absolutely need a commitment from the Treasury Secretary. So you need a president, you need a Treasury Secretary that likes it, knows it, can cut the deal for the president. The third thing you need is a chairman of Ways and Means and Finance who want to get this done, who see that some of their own political interests are served by getting this done. And Bob mentioned Dan Rostenkowski. In 1981, we passed the bill, which President Reagan put forward the first year, cutting rates 30%. And Dan Rostenkowski ended up being labeled as the king of special interests. And so I think that what he saw in this was an opportunity to seize the good government mantle and push forward with a challenge that would make him a historic chairman of Ways and Means. And I think the Senate was very fortunate to have Bob Packwood as the chairman, because I don't know specifically what your political interests were, but I sensed that it was that you wanted to do something that no other chairman of the Finance Committee had ever done before, and you wanted to do something that would affect 100 million Americans in a positive way and potentially change the way we think about taxes. Without Bob Packwood and Dan Rostenkowski and Jim Baker and President Reagan, this would never have happened. You have to have those parts in place, and then you have a chance. And then the fifth thing you need is maybe a zealot. That's the role I played in 1986. I did nothing but talk about tax reform for 4 years. Every speech would be tax reform. It got so bad, I remember I was on a Sunday morning interview show that was recorded on a Thursday night and rebroadcast on Sunday. And at that time, my daughter was about 8 or 9 years old, and she had a girlfriend of hers staying with us. And I said, "Hey, Teresa, stay. Dad's going to be on TV." And because the guy said, Eyewitness News Conference of the Air, Senator Bill Bradley, stick around. Dad's going to be on TV. So she elbowed her friend and said, "Come on, let's go. All he's going to talk about are loopholes." And indeed, that was all I talked about for 4 years. And I also I recognized I did not have the power. The power was with Bob Packwood and Dan Rostenkowski. So I had to be supportive in any way I could, and I tried to play that role. The sixth thing that you need, if you're going to get it passed, is you need a committed, knowledgeable staff. I remember Bob's staff absolutely first rate. And the key thing in this is that they can cut the deal on a lot of issues, and everybody knows they speak for the chairman, and they say the same thing to everybody. They don't say one thing to one person, another thing to another, but they keep their word just like the senator keeps his or her word. So I think that those are the six that I think you need. You need a president who's committed. You need a treasury secretary who's committed and knowledgeable. You need a chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and a chairman of the Finance Committee. You maybe or maybe not need a zealot. And then you need to have a staff that is competent and honorable and has absolute integrity. The last thing I think you need, and this is probably the most important thing, was epitomized by a visit that we made to the White House to meet President Reagan. Now, I was a Democrat, kind of a junior member, and I wasn't invited a lot to the White House to meet President Reagan, but there I was, seated around the table in the West Wing. And if you recall, each of us could go around the table and tell the president what we thought about tax reform. He was listening, mainly not talking. So when it came to me, even though he'd made his commitment and even though he's made his position clear, I said, "Mr. President, I know you're interested in tax reform, which means lower rates, because when you were an actor, the rates were 90%. He kind of nodded. And I said, "Mr. President, I'm interested in tax reform because when I was a basketball player, I was a depreciable asset," which in fact I was. In other words, what that story says is there's got to be something for each party in a deal. It can't be all one. There's got to be something for each party. Each party has to know what they want, and then if they do, there's a chance to get something done. I'll make only two other quick comments. Bob talked about writing the bill in a short period of time with 7 people. Again, the only reason that happened is because Bob Packwood wanted it to happen. He was the chairman. If I had called 7 people, they said, yeah, okay, meet you in the cafeteria tomorrow or next day or 2 years from now. But when the chairman called, you show up. And so it was because of him that committee, that small committee of committees worked. But he also mentioned that when we were headed down the path that the House did for a long period of time, we had 30 hearings about tax reform. Bob presided over every one. I was at every one. And we asked questions of every witness. And the question that he mentioned was one of them, which was, how low would the rate have to go before you give up this, that, or the other thing? And I asked, how low would the rate have to go before you give up before you give up capital gains exclusion? And in the latter, the answers came back. If you were from Silicon Valley, the witness would say, I don't care if the rate is 10%, we still need a differential for capital gains because that will affect capital appreciation and capital formation. But a lot of other people came in. I don't want to say just Silicon Valley, but there was a certain kind of person that said, no matter what, you got to have a differential. Other people said, well, if you got the rate down to about 28%, 29%, we'd give up that differential for capital gains. And that is indeed what we did. We got the rate to 28, and that 28% was the rate that applied to both capital and earned income. So, Mr. Chairman, with those thoughts, I would thank the committee for the opportunity to come back to the room once every 25 years.
Well, we're honored to have both of you here, and I think anybody listening to this has to realize that you went through a very trying time, very difficult. Congress was split. You had a Republican president. I just want you both to know how much I respect and appreciate both of you. You can start the timer now. Okay, let me just ask this question. According to CBO, revenues as a percentage of GDP have averaged 17.4% over the past 50 years. Revenues in 2014 were 17.5% of GDP, trending up to 18.3% of GDP by 2025. In other words, taxes are higher now than their historical average and headed even higher. Since taxes are already higher than average and raising revenue in tax reform makes enacting it less likely, shouldn't we do tax reform on a revenue-neutral basis? We'll start with you, Senator Packwood.
Well, yeah, I would much prefer you do it on a revenue-neutral basis, although I would combine both corporate and individual into one bill. And then you have a little more wiggle room using either side of that equation to be able to reach your revenue neutrality.
Okay. Phil?
We, of course, did it revenue neutral. I think the times today probably might require some additional tax, but I believe that that's something that the committee has to work out itself. If you really do thorough tax reform, what you find is, at least we found, that upper income Americans will pay a higher percent. For example, we cut the rate from 50 to 28, and yet the top 5% paid a higher percent of the total tax revenue after that reduction than before.
Well, the U.S. is one of 5 major economies operating on a worldwide tax system, meaning it currently taxes the income of its companies wherever that income is earned, even if it's not in our country. Currently, companies have the option of bringing the profits they earn back to the U.S., but they face a tax of 35% minus foreign tax credits. Those businesses that would rather not pay this additional tax and keep their earnings abroad, deferring the additional tax. And current Utah law, U.S. law, I better say, allows companies to defer the tax indefinitely. President Obama's proposal, released in this year's budget, would substantially limit deferral since it imposes a minimum tax of 19%. Now, do you think we should go to a territorial tax system with base erosion protections like most other major countries, in fact, most all other major companies, or not?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I've thought so for the last 30 years. We're often said, we have to compete overseas, and here's the advantages they have. And one of the advantages they have is territorial. And I think we ought to go to the system that the rest of the principal industrial countries use, which is if you invest overseas and you make profits overseas and you pay your taxes overseas, you can bring back whatever profit you have to this country and they're not taxed, and I think that's a good system.
Of course, when you have profits overseas and you're taxed in a particular country at the rate that that country charges, all of those taxes are deducted against your liability in the United States, the tax credit. So I think you have a clear view of how these works. The President's proposed two things, I think. One is a 19% tax on the deferred income going forward, and a 14% tax as a toll on the tax that's abroad. I think that the committee will have to work its will on that. I think that the territorial tax makes sense in terms of the overall picture, but in reality, you're going to have to figure out, is there some other way, so I don't think that's going to happen, is there some other way that you could bring the money back? And I think embodied in the President's proposal of the 14% is the possibility that maybe it's not 14, maybe it's 10, maybe it's not 19, maybe it's less. But somewhere in there, like when we did where do you give up capital gains at what rate, there's a willingness to bring the capital back.
Well, my time is up. Senator
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the two of you have told an inspiring story this morning about bipartisanship on a major economic issue. And colleagues, we just looked up the vote that attests to what happened. It was 97-3. The original vote coming in the Senate, and then on the conference report, it was 74-23. And in the House, it was more than 2/3. So this kind of work paid off. What I'd like to start with is asking you about the process, because as far as I can tell, in this effort to promote bipartisanship every step of the way, you said we're going to use the normal process, because the normal process in the Senate really promotes bipartisanship. And you have to have 60 votes, and certainly neither side today has 60 votes. So you use the normal process, and it really forces bipartisanship. The alternative is to use what's called reconciliation, which in effect just has 51 votes. One side now has 51 votes. They could have their way on tax reform. My question to both of you, either one who wants to start, is it your view that using the normal process, which you all used in 1986, was helpful? And is it your assessment that using the normal process helps promote bipartisanship? Either one of you.
Yeah, absolutely, but for a variety of reasons. One, every member of this committee ought to have misgivings about reconciliation and using it to jam as many things into a bill as the majority wants because they're not sure they can get it passed any other way. What that lends itself to is more and more the decisions moving up to the leadership. In my era, let alone now, even in Lyndon Johnson's era, no majority leader would have ever thought of taking a bill away from committee. Reconciliation just holds out that plum and says, use it this way. No, I'd much prefer the regular order for a couple of reasons. One, it can still, the arguments against it, we had no chance. We didn't get to offer the amendments. There was a time limit. And if you win it in the normal process, you've got a lot better credibility than if you've jammed it through in reconciliation.
Senator Bradley, can you top that?
No, but I'll have a comment or two. Your question was what, Mr. Chairman?
Normal process. I mean,
I think
the
that-
normal process, inviting bipartisanship, reconciliation, going more of a partisan track.
I think the way that we did it, I would agree with Senator Packwood 100%, that the normal process is better. Also has to do with what's the clout of the committee in the larger Senate. We had agreement among members of the committee that whenever a vote would come up on the floor, none of the committee members would break from the bill that was reported out of the Finance Committee and would stay with the committee bill. And that was a point of personal anguish for me, because in the committee, as it related to what Senator Packwood referred were the oilies, Senator Packwood was the chair, and at that time Senator Russell Long, Louisiana, was the ranking member, and he had a few interests in the oil patch. And I, of course, was going to go after it. We have to go after that. We can't leave that out. We were meeting in secret back there, and we had a vote in the back room, and it was 11-9 against me. And I viewed that, this was in the back room, but if there was one senator who was taken in public, he wouldn't vote that way. And so I then raised the issue in the committee, full committee, and I saw Senator Long's head go like that, and I called for the vote. And the person who I thought would switch didn't switch. And right up there against that wall, afterwards, Russell Long got a hold of me and said, "If you ever do that again." But life went on, and the screw turned. We got to the Senate floor, and then Republican Senator Lowell Weicker offered the exact amendment that I had offered in the Finance Committee. But because we had a deal that we were all going to stay together, I voted against my own amendment. So the clout of the Finance Committee in the Senate as a whole is instrumental in getting a bill passed, because most of the other senators don't know a whole lot about taxes. They have a few opinions about this, that, and the other thing. And to the extent that you can speak clearly, authoritatively, and hang together, you won't need to have any kind of reconciliation.
Senator Hatch said I could ask one other question, because this was a remarkable feature of the 86 bill, and I think it would be helpful for the committee to know how you two got to common ground in 86. In 1986, you were able to say that income from wages and income from capital was treated equally. And Senator Bradley talked a little bit about his views on it. But I think it would be very helpful to know how you two reached that judgment that by today's standards would be remarkable. In fact, today people say if you could just reduce the difference between the way income from capital and the income from wages was treated, that'd be a huge reform. How did you two in 1986 get to common ground on treating wage income and capital income the same?
Well, realize we wanted to keep the same progressivity that we had in the existing law, but we were going to lower the rates tremendously. So in order to make sure that the very wealthy still were roughly in the same progressivity incline, we had to get rid of capital gains, the differential. It was as simple as that. In fact, it didn't even really bother the committee that much. It was a small issue. Malcolm Wallop had some misgivings about it, and he did, I say to his credit, we agreed. Remember, Bill, we made the rate the same, but we didn't put it as a separate section of the bill, because Malcolm Wallop says, you put that in the bill and get rid of capital gains, as in the word, And then pretty soon, Congress is going to start to raise the rates, and capital gains will go right up with them. Now, it turns out he was right. But it was to make sure our progressivity was the same.
Just a little addition to that, I exactly agree with what Senator Packwood said. There was a provision in the bill since we got to the magic number of 28 for both capital and earned income. We had a provision in the bill that said if the general rate ever went higher than 28%, the capital gains rate would be 28%. In other words, you would never tax capital higher than 28. And I remember, it might have been 4 months after the passage of that bill, people were in saying we need a differential in capital gains. And my point was, if you take a differential in capital gains, you're going to end up with a much higher general rate. And indeed, that's precisely what happened when President Clinton came in. The capital gains went back in, and the rates went to 39%. And it seems to me that there's a lot more coherence in a bill with a lower rate that treats capital and labor the same.
Well, thank you, Senator Grassley.
Thank you both for coming. I want to start with something you both touched on in your opening statement, but to get more specific, so I'll start with Senator Packwood, but I'll ask Senator Bradley the similar question. It deals with the process and presidential involvement. Do you think tax reform, Senator Packwood, do you think tax reform would have happened if President Reagan had not made tax reform a priority in his administration and a follow-on? Then isn't it going to take at least that much commitment or involvement from President Obama with his own party in Congress to get a tax reform bill enacted? And then for Senator Bradley, could you share your thoughts on the importance of presidential leadership in accomplishing tax reform? Senator Packwood.
Well, President Reagan was immensely helpful. If you're asking me, is it absolutely essential that the president be there from day one and pushing? I don't know. It's like saying this committee couldn't reach its own conclusion without the president. But it was very helpful. And one morning, there was a small breakfast at the White House. So just Danny and me and the president, the vice president, Jim Baker. And at the end of it, it was before the bill had passed here, but before conference. And the president took Danny and me aside right at the end. And he said, if you can keep this bill revenue neutral and you can get the rates that you've got, he says, you may count on my support no matter how you get to those rates. So that's how critical it was. We knew we had his backing, absolutely. But Bill touched on something that was about the Treasury. Jim Baker was up to his neck in the negotiations with us, and was especially his Assistant Treasury Secretary, Dick Darman, because in the last 7 days that I talked about where this was all done, Baker wasn't here. He was in Tokyo with the president, one of those economic multi-nation meetings, and all of the final negotiations for the administration were done by Darman. And on the last paragraph of my testimony, you'll see an interesting exchange on the phone between Darman calling Baker in Tokyo and telling him what to tell the president. So is it critical? I don't know if it's critical. Is it immensely helpful? And was it immensely helpful? Yes.
Senator Bradley.
I think presidential leadership is essential. I believe that there are so many times when things happen that you need to have be able to get the White House's clout. And that can be manifested through the Treasury Secretary. It's not you talking to the president all the time. But I also would say, as going back to my anecdote, I think the president was viscerally in favor of lowering tax rates because when he was an actor, he had a 90% rate, 90%. And I was viscerally in favor of this because of the depreciable asset as a basketball player. In other words, closing loopholes had traditionally been what Democrats were for. lowering rates were traditionally what Republicans were for. The question is, can you bridge that divide and bring something together? The answer is yes. But if Ronald Reagan had not said, I put my imprimatur on this, it would not have happened.
Well, and Bill touched on something right there, Senator Grassley. Democrats wanted to get rid of unjustifiable deductions. Republicans were not adverse to going along with that if they could use the money to lower the rates. And as President Reagan had said, I'm not signing it unless it's revenue neutral. If you got rid of a lot of deductions and produced a pot full of money and you couldn't raise revenues with this bill, you had to use it to lower rates. But you had a willingness on both sides for different reasons to want to reach the same conclusion.
My last question deals with something we have to tackle here in a basic way. So both of you, in your view, how important was it that the 86 bill was comprehensive tax reform package rather than focusing only on business or, on the other hand, individual reform and getting support for its passage?
Well, for us, it was critical because we needed a lot of the money we raised from business. Remember, don't confuse rates with revenue. We raised an immense amount of revenue, more than we were raising from businesses before, but we lowered the rates. And we used a lot of their money to lower rates for individuals, and we mixed the two of them up. I would have misgivings about trying to do just business, and then later on we'll try to do just individual. I think you're better off to try to do both of them at once in one big bill. And I want to use the word grandeur again. You come out with a big bill that you've agreed upon, and if you do, and it touches the points Bill and I have talked about, before the bill ever gets to the floor of the Senate, you're going to have immense newspaper support, academic support across the board, liberal to conservative, and you will be glad in retrospect that you combined it all in one.
I agree. We should. You should combine both corporate and individual, because if you just do corporate, it's not like you're going to have an easy path if you do anything that's serious. For example, when we did the individual and corporate, essentially the business community split. Large percent of the business community were for the reform. Another segment of the business community was against reform. Guess what was the dividing line? What tax rate they paid. If they paid less taxes because the rate went from 50 to 28, they were for it. If they paid up more, they were against it. But the key was constructing a coalition that included a significant part of business. And this is where Bob was brilliant. And so I would argue that that's very important. You also might get to a point where you might have more flexibility if you do individual and corporate, because they both are essentially two sides of the same coin. For example, you might decide that you want to cut the corporate rate to 10% or 15%. And you might want to offset that by increasing the taxes on the individual side on dividends and capital gains. That's what they do in Denmark, for example. You wouldn't have that flexibility if you didn't have both individual and corporate put together in the same bill.
Thank you. Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, both of you, for being here. I was a real estate guy in 1986 and had a development company and a brokerage company. So I have a question for both of you. First of all, thanks for being on the 9 who voted against selected treatment in terms of passive loss. I think that's right. Both of you voted against that, if I'm not mistaken. Oil and gas won, real estate kind of lost. But looking in a rearview mirror, had some transition been applied to those investments made prior to 86 so that the tax treatment could have continued and the tax treatment on passive loss been prospective rather than a clawback? Did you ever think about doing that, or if we go into something again, could we do it that way?
We did not think about it at the time, and he's absolutely right. If there was an industry that we hit, it was real estate. And we drove the S&Ls out of business, who were one of the principal financiers of real estate. And we did not do it. We did not do it retroactively. I mean, we did it retroactively. We found passive losses such a grievous way for rich people to shell their money and pay very little taxes that we got rid of it. But Senator, you're absolutely right. The real estate industry was hit hard, and the oil industry got a particular favor because of a deal that I made because I was going to need their votes later on the floor on a particular issue.
Senator Bradley?
I agree that the real estate industry paid more. If you phase it in, of course, you have not as much revenue, and you also skew the distributional tables. But in regard to real estate, keep in mind that was at a time where there were, I would say, real estate tax shelters that were investment was not based on the need for apartments or office space, but was based upon the individual taxpayer getting a tax deduction offset against all his other income or her other income. I had a call sometime in this period from Paul Volcker, who was then the Federal Reserve Chairman. And he said, you know, I really like what you guys are doing up there. And I said, why is that? And he says, because I can't get at these banks who are simply throwing money at uneconomic real estate investments. And it has to be through the tax code. So I think that's one of the reasons, at least for me, that I felt that we were on strong ground.
I think you did the right thing because it was abused. My point was, if you could have transitioned prospectively in terms of the treatment of passive loss rather than clawback, you might have prevented the collapse of the savings and loans and the creation of the REITs, which is both basically what the ramifications were.
Yep, I think you're right.
One other question I have: did you ever?
Well, I wouldn't say that the savings and loans collapsed because of the Tax Reform Act.
No, it was the last. It was the last straw, I guess. That would be.
Yeah, maybe that's a better way to say it.
My other question is: did you consider in 1986, or have you thought since, about going to a retail sales tax or a consumption tax instead of a progressive income tax?
Well, I haven't. I've often thought to myself, what kind of a deal could be made between the Republicans and the Democrats that would result in some increased revenue? And I thought, what happens if the Democrats were to offer this to the Republicans? We'll go to an electronic funds transaction tax, which I prefer to a VAT or retail sales tax, and we will cut in half the corporate and individual income tax. And you will allow the tax, however, to produce an additional $500 billion in revenue. And now the Republicans are thinking, wow, you can cut the income tax in half and the corporate in half, and we're not really, and we've always kind of supported a consumption tax anyway. Is that kind of a deal possible? We'll go to it one day. There's no question in my mind. The danger of any kind of a consumption tax is probably why Republicans are more afraid of it. It is so easy to raise. Need a little more money? Well, you raise it 0.5%. And any of you, take a look at your sales taxes in different states that started at 1% or 2% 30 years ago. And they're now at 8 or 9%. Look at the European value-added taxes. I don't know of any major country in Europe that's not less than 20% on the value-added tax. But to answer your question, yes. If you could combine it, I think there's a possibility that you could possibly, I can maybe see the Republicans shaking their heads, you could possibly make an argument for some increased revenue in exchange for dramatic reductions in corporate and individual taxes.
Out of time, but real quickly, Senator Bradley, I'd love to hear your comment.
I think that what Senator Packwood said about electronic transfer tax is extremely interesting. You know, if I were the chairman, I would task the Joint Tax Committee to do an analysis of that in terms of revenue that could be generated, because you got to know what revenue you're going to generate before you decide how you want to spend it. On the consumption tax issue, in my testimony, I make a suggestion. Basically, the point is that we should tax less those things we like, such as wages, and tax more those things which are bad for us or dangerous, which are pollution, for example. And I think here there could be a very interesting trade-off between employment taxes, Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment, and a gasoline tax, or a tax on things like volatile organics, or sulfur dioxide, or lead, or nitrous oxide, or whatever, right? It's just a numbers game. And if you did that, it would be have profound impact. For example, if you were able to dramatically cut both individual and corporate Social Security employment taxes, you would, in essence, be giving individuals a tax cut and corporations a tax cut at a time where jobs are needed. The fact that there's this 15% hurdle is, it affects different industries in different ways. For example, if you're McKinsey or Microsoft and you want to hire, or Google, or you want to hire real talent, you pay them more because you really need that talent, so that you pay them more to offset the employment tax. If you're, working in a lumber yard in Oregon or somewhere where there's a surplus of labor, you don't pay them more to offset it. So the irony is that it ends up hitting the lower paid guy in the struggling industry more than it hits the person who's in the consulting or technology industry. So reducing those employment taxes have many benefits. For example, the 24 million people or 25 million people who are working part-time now could very well be brought into the workforce. You could find people that weren't working that could be brought into the workforce. So that's the good news. The question is, what are you going to use to provide the money to do that? And, I know the committee has looked at it. It's probably not possible, but who knows? They said tax reform wasn't possible in '86. You could take a dollar gasoline tax, or you could take a carbon tax and use all that money to reduce those employment taxes. And I think the net benefit would be greater job creation and economic growth. It would hit certain sectors more than others, obviously. But let's just take the dollar gasoline tax. It never could it be offered, would it be a better time to do it than now when prices are where they are. But let's say you phase it in, as you suggested you do on the other things. If you phased in a gasoline tax over 5 years and the automobile industry was going to improve the mileage efficiency, at the end of that 5 years, since the individual would be getting more miles with less gasoline, they would be paying no more for gasoline with a dollar tax that could be used to reduce Social Security taxes and employment taxes than they're paying now without that.
Senator Nelson.
And could also, Senator Bradley, improve the roads and bridges that are crumbling. This has been a fascinating discussion for me, and thank you very much. And I take your ideas and try to put them into today's politics. Offsetting, lowering employment taxes and going after something like nitrous oxide. And that's much more difficult today because of the climate debate that is going on, getting the votes. I think about what you said, Senator Packwood, that President Reagan was so critical in tamping down the opposition among Republicans in the House. Well, how are you going to get President Obama to tamp down that opposition. Today, just over the knee-jerk reaction of some Republicans to the word tax. So it's hard for me to make the transition from your success in '86 to today. And it really puts a real burden on the shoulders of our chairman and ranking member.
Well, that's why this committee, at least in Bill's and my era, there was much more nonpartisanship in the Senate than there apparently is today. I can't tell you whether or not you can put it together, but in 1986, it appeared to us just as difficult to put it together as it appears to you now. There are different issues than we had then. And nobody can make the right circumstances. You can't buy them, you can't wish them, you can't coerce them. All you can do is be around when the circumstance comes and hope you can take advantage of it. I say maybe there's a possibility. But if at the start we're going to say, the Republicans say, no bill if there's any revenue increases total. And if the Democratic position is no bill unless there's some revenue increases, then you might as well spend your time working on the Asia-Pacific Trade Agreement or something like that.
You know, our problem thus far, since a lot of your success, has been we're in this kind of herky-jerky patch at the 11th hour. Tax extenders, an example. You want to give us your thought about how we take this illogical approach to taxes? Do you have to do it in the overall global kind of big deal in order to get it done?
Tax extenders are a lobbyist full employment act.
Yes.
You know, you have to bite the bullet and make some decisions. What should be permanent, what shouldn't be permanent? And there are always questions of revenue, so you always, you want it to go out a year or two, but not 3 or 4, because that would affect the revenue. And I just think that, you know, the practical reality is that people would probably say extenders are necessary. But they're necessary only because fundamental choices are not made about the tax code. What kind of tax code do you want? What do you want in? What do you want out?
Right.
Not what do you want in this year, because then we all know that means you're lobbied every year about the same thing. And quite frankly, it becomes boring, I would think, for you. You know the arguments before they come in. So on your earlier point about nitrous oxide, you know, you would be cutting some taxes. Social Security. Recall a couple of years ago you cut the Social Security tax, and then there was a quiet deal and you let it go back up and nobody said anything about it, right? Not one party attacked the other party. Well, that's the kind of thing you could get here with the employment tax reduction and the increased taxes on essentially either pollutants or gas or carbon.
I have mixed feelings about extenders. You make some of these permanent, you're going to play hell ever getting rid of them when a time comes you think you ought to get rid of them. At least with extenders, you are forced to look at them at least and think, should this be kept? And then, of course, everything falls apart and you extend them all. But let's say you made them all permanent. Now you don't have to look at them until somebody says, oh, I wonder if we should look at this one. So you kind of pay your money and take your choice on it.
Thank you.
Next is Senator Coates.
Well, Mr. Chairman, this has been fascinating for me. I'm a rookie senator sitting, I can't use a basketball analogy, but I can use a baseball analogy, in the left field bleachers here with my friend from Nevada. Had to extend the rostrum here to accommodate the three of us. So
It's a right field.
well,
right
that's
field
home
bleachers,
plate.
if you look
That's
at
home
this-
plate. I figure I'm in the left field, but although I would prefer to be in the right field. nevertheless, having had the opportunity to serve with these two distinguished former senators, just sitting here, listening to them talk through the process has been fascinating. And so often we take an issue and we start with the substance of the issue, and nobody pays attention to the process until everything comes to a grinding halt, because the process wasn't set at the beginning in terms of what is it going to take to get from here to there. And so it was fascinating to me that both of you outlined the principles of the process that you had to work through in order to accomplish the goal. And it occurs to me, Mr. Chairman, that a buy-in of the committee with the principles up front to prevent us from having to be seduced away either through ideology or through special interest group pressure on particulars. Well, okay, I can get behind you if you exclude this or include that, traps us from getting from the batter's box all the way around to home plate. So I just thought a fascinating lesson in history here, and I had the great pleasure of serving with both of you, being in the House in 1986, but watching what was happening there as a somewhat neophyte member of the House, and then now all of a sudden having the opportunity sitting here thinking, could this really be done? And what you've left with us is, yes, if we as a committee can avoid the pitfalls of making prejudgments as to what ought to be in, what ought to be out, and look at how we could accomplish something of enormous impact for the future of America, for a whole generation. I think that's what we're looking at here. What a legacy that would be to you, Mr. Chairman, to Ranking Member, to all of us on this committee. It appeared to me that there are some stars lining up here between the House and the Senate, given the personalities, the experience, and the background of the leadership of the Ways and Means, as well as the Finance Committee here. Question mark in terms of where the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania are starting from relative to their situation and relative to their income level and the things that caused them the eureka moment to say, yeah, I want to get on board that. And to me, it seems like, I'm just going on here, but it seems like the real challenge here is to address the question of how a lower rate and cleaner product can result in the kind of growth and the dynamic economic impact of something that we would do, and where that money should go. Should it go back into government for expenditures, as perhaps appealing as it might be? How many roads could we pave and how many bridges could we fix? Or do we let the market determine how that capital is better invested? It's really not asking the question. If the panelists want to comment on that, I was just actually making a statement, Mr. Over my time here.
I'll comment only in one sense. Senator Wyden, you may remember my predecessor, for whom you worked at one time, used to use the expression, give me control of the procedures of democracy and I will control the substance of democracy. Dan, this process in 1986 was not really a planned procedure. The House had pretty much ceded to us the right to go ahead and write the bill, and if we wrote it the way Danny liked it, they'd adopt it. But I wasn't making any progress following normal procedures. It was only when the thing was not moving at all that I came up with this idea about what about a half a dozen of us getting together in secret as quick as possible. And in that group we had, 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats. We had an agreement. If any 4 of us could agree on something, it would be put in the chairman's mark. I recall no vote that was 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats. I recall a number of votes where I was on the 3 side of a vote. But we had that agreement. I mean, it was that bipartisan in that sense. But it wasn't planned. It was nothing else has worked. And yet the circumstance was there to make something work. And that's how it happened.
You see that circumstance there?
Well, I don't know if the circumstance is here. You feel it. You don't plan for it. It arrives. And I'm not sure I know how to make it arrive.
I'm trying to get that feeling. Senator Carper, you're next.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Wyden, to Chairman Packwood, to my friend Bill Bradley, it's great to see you. Just great to see you. I was talking with Brian Sealander the other day, whom you graciously sent to me when you withdrew from the presidential race, sent him to Delaware, signed him up to my Senate race. And one of the reasons why I'm here today is because of that kind gift, along with Sean Barney and a couple of brothers who came as well. So thank you for all of them. Now I serve on this committee where you both once provided great leadership. A couple of years ago, we had having a hearing on the issue of deficit reduction, and we had a bunch of really smart people here to talk to us that day too. One of them was Alan Blinder. He had previously been the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, as you may recall. He's back now teaching economics at some school in New Jersey. He starts with a P. Princeton, that's it. And anyway, in his testimony, he said to us, he said, in terms of deficit reduction, 800-pound gorilla in the room on deficit reduction is healthcare costs. He says, if we don't get our arms around that, we're doomed. And he said more than that, but that was the sum and substance of what he said. We had a chance to ask questions. It came to be my time to ask a question. I said, Dr. Blinder, you say healthcare costs the 800-pound gorilla in the room. If we don't get our arms around that, then we're doomed. And I said, what's your advice to us? He sat there for a while, and thought, and then he finally said, well, I'm not a health economist, I'm not an expert on that stuff, but he said, this would be my advice to you. Here's what I'd advise. He said, find out what works. Do more of that. That's all he said. Find out what works, do more of that. And I said, you mean find out what doesn't work and do less of that? And he said, yeah. And we're happy you're here and looking to find out, and you've given us some ideas of what worked, although those many years ago. And one of the keys is clear to me in what you're saying here, leadership. The most important ingredient in the organization, whether it's a basketball team, whether it's a military unit in the Navy, Army, Air Force, Marine Corps, whether it's a college or university of business, the most important here, the most important ingredient is leadership. And we can't pass laws to create leadership, but every now and then people come along and provide great leadership. Just talk about leadership, the importance of leadership here, and what our leaders, what our leaders of this committee and in the Senate especially, what we need to be doing. Please.
Well, as I said earlier, leadership starts from the President, the Treasury Secretary, Chairman of Ways and Means, and Chairman of Finance Committee. That's the leadership structure. If any one of those isn't on board, it's not going to happen. I would also make the point, when Senator Packwood talked about the 7 people in the room and voting 4-3, whoever voted, he lost some time, I lost some time, but it was 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats. That was fun. Legislating is fun with the right people. You can do something very important, and you can enjoy what you're doing because you never know what's coming around tomorrow if you're in that kind of negotiation. And it requires you to know what you're talking about. And, you know, I just hope you guys are having that much fun.
Fun would be good around here.
I've got to tell a humorous story about Bill. Because
remember, I only have a little bit of time, so I hope it's a short
I'm
one.
sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Answer if you could. Just answer if you want to. Just, I'd love to hear the story about Bill, but a question about leadership, and I think what Senator Bradley told us is very important. Right on. Yeah.
Well, you know, all of us in politics have seen natural leaders. Some of them are inside leaders like Lyndon Johnson, some are outside leaders like Ronald Reagan. But everybody in the Senate, there's a small fraternity. We all know who are the standout leaders. We knew in my era that Scoop Jackson and Sam Nunn on defense were good for 7 or 8 votes and a tight vote anytime. Mm-hmm. We knew that Dick Lugar was on foreign policy, was good for 6 or 7 votes. They were leaders in their area. All of you on this committee know who the half a dozen leaders of this committee are. I don't know who they are, but you know. And certainly the ranking member and chairman know who they are. And a coalition of those can be put together. But the key is not, do you have the leadership? Does the little leadership group agree on the goal that they want to reach? If they don't agree on the goal, no quantity of leadership is going to make any difference.
All right, thank you. Second question deals with, you did all this work in '86, and sooner was the ink dry on the legislation that you labored on for all those years, and we started changing it. A whole lot over time. And did you ever think at the time that we'd see this kind of change that quickly and in to such an extent? And did you ever think at the time about what can we do to sort of preserve what we have, at least for a while? And I don't know how many changes we've seen, but I'm told like 15,000 or something, and maybe more since '86. But what should we be thinking about? Should we keep looking for some way to preserve for a while at least what work we're going to do, or is that just a fool's errand?
Mm-hmm. Well, Tom, that was a real lesson for me, that obviously one Congress can't bind another Congress. You can pass something, which I thought, and I think Bob did, and people generally, as significant as tax reform, and it can be like a sandcastle on the edge of the sea. It can be washed away the next year, which means you have to be humble when you do these things, and you have to, I don't think there is an institutional fix to make things permanent. Maybe the reason this wasn't permanent was that, this wasn't something that bubbled up from the country saying you must do this. This was something that happened because people who had responsibility on this committee assessed what was the right thing for the country.
All right. Senator Packwood, just very briefly, and my time's expired, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Senator Heller?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thanks for holding this hearing, and I want to begin by thanking our distinguished guests for being here today. As a relatively new member of the Senate and a new member of this committee, it's great to get this historical perspective. So thank you very much for taking time. Mr. Chairman, I want to also thank you and the ranking member for being committed to this effort. I know it's not going to be easy, but it's good to see that there is real work moving forward. And I appreciate your 7 priorities, and I share those with you and look forward to getting that done. To our witnesses, the further you get out here in left field, the more general the questions. But the good news is it's good to know that both of you started where I am today. So there's hope for the future. I want to move to 5 years ago on the Bowles-Simpson proposal. Did either of you testify or have an opportunity to put any input on that particular proposal?
I did not. I was not called as a witness. I followed it very carefully in the press, but I was not a witness before that commission.
Can you give me any perspective what you thought of that report?
Well, I thought the report was excellent in the sense of here's where this country is going if we don't do something. I've often put it, when I speak, I put it in a different version. I am less concerned about the deficit than I am about the increased spending. If you're rich enough, you can afford a deficit. As long as you stay rich, you can afford to pay the interest on a debt. But I look at spending, and the figures are not that necessarily good from a century ago, but as best we can tell, a century ago, all of the governments in this country, federal, state, local, water districts, fire districts, spent about 10% of the gross domestic product. Today, the same governments spend around 40% of the gross domestic product. And that same pattern has been true, by the way, at all of the major industrial countries. They just started at a higher point a century ago than where we were. But if you look at the Simpson-Bowles report and you see what's coming in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that 40% figure is going to go up. And the debate we ought to be having in this country is not, is there a deficit? Of course there is. You can debate if you want, can we afford to carry it? I think we can. But do you want this country to eventually spend 45, 50, or 55% of all the available assets in this country on government? And that debate doesn't get discussed very often because it gets mixed up with the deficit.
Thank you. Senator Bradley, I propose the same question to you.
No, I was not, I did not testify. I always talk to my buddy Al Simpson, but
Yeah.
we didn't spend a lot of time talking about taxes.
He's one of my favorites, Alan Simpson. I was on the, when I was in the House, I was on the Ways and Means Committee, and Dave Camp was my chairman. As you know, Bull Simpson was dead on arrival. Camp came up with a proposal last year, and as you're well aware of, got no hearings and frankly was dead on arrival. What do we learn? What lesson do we learn from these efforts?
You're discouraged. I read the Camp proposal. I thought it was a good proposal. I thought it covered a lot of the bases that needed to be covered. And you're right, it was dead on arrival. This is one, I'm not going to badmouth the president, but it irritated me that he appoints this commission. Mm-hmm. And as soon as it comes out, he just gives it the back of his hand. Well, that practically kills it right there. But I thought the commission did a first-rate job.
Sure.
I think Camp had some interesting ideas. What happened, he kind of started too late. People knew he was going out the door, and he did his own thing and put something specific forward, which is a necessary prerequisite. Remember Treasury 1, Treasury 2, the two bills I put in. You have to put something specific, because then the interests chew it up and you figure out what can be swallowed and what can't. And so I just think that you need to see the total picture. I think he did a very good job of thinking through tax policy and coming out with a coherent package.
Senator Bennett, you're next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and what a great privilege to have both of you here. I was thinking back, actually, as Senator Packwood was talking to, believe it or not, John McPhee's book, A Sense of Where You Are, a book about Senator Bradley when he was playing basketball at Princeton, and it sort of asked the question, how could this, maybe not the best athlete that we had, maybe not the best of this or that, succeed so well at what he was doing? And I think in terms of tax reform, Senator Packwood interestingly said the opportunity appears to do it. And so with that in mind, I wanted to read, I took a look at Showdown at Gucci Gulch in advance of your arrival in the first chapter, and I think it's worth the historical perspective. The authors wrote, and I just sort of asked you to respond to it for us. The groups with an interest in the existing tax system were well organized and ready to defend their tax breaks at a moment's notice. The populace who stood to benefit from lower rates were unorganized and diffuse. Furthermore, Congress was a slow and cumbersome institution, that's not true anymore, of course, that usually made only piecemeal incremental changes. Tax reform proposed something very different, a radical revamping of the entire tax structure. There was a tremendous inertia in Congress that resisted any such sweeping change. As a result, the conventional wisdom in Washington held that tax reform was destined to lose, and the conventional wisdom had plenty of history to back it up. Tax breaks, after all, had always been part of the currency of Congress. This passage, I would say, is even truer today than it was 30 years ago as a description of where we are. Just in 2014, federal lobbying totaled over $3.2 billion. I wonder if you could take us inside that room that you talked about and tell us a little bit, as senators, how you were able to overcome these interests and the pressures that you faced, and how we as senators should think about that in the arc of our careers on this committee.
Well, if you're talking about the little cabal of 7 of us, the pressures were not really that great on us. We knew what had to be done. We were wondering, can we swing it? Will it work? But I don't recall any one of us saying, I'm not going along with this if X is in this bill or if X is not in this bill. So those pressures were not on us. I know what you mean about the interest groups, and that's what happened to the House bill. They had a lot of individual votes on each of those little parts, and if it hits your part and you hate that, you're against the bill. You don't care what's in the rest of it, you hate the bill, and there was enough of that. That was not in the Senate. The Senate bill just didn't happen that way. That Senate bill was written in those 7 days, and we didn't have any hearings. And it was suddenly, it was like Minerva, born fully formed. Here on the last night, does the committee see the whole bill for the first time and vote for it 20-0? But had they had to vote on individual little sections, now, in fact, I will give you this, the reason I made this deal, I never told Bill why I did this. The reason I made the deal with the oilies and gave them what they wanted when nobody else got it, and we'd taken it away from everybody else, and I gave it back to them. Bill was furious. George Mitchell was furious because I hadn't bounced this off my little group because it was the night we were voting anyway. The reason I did it is because the biggest issue I was going to face on the floor, when this came out of committee, 20-0 is going to pass, but there was one issue, and it was the IRAs. On the IRAs, there's not 2 sides. There wasn't a great clamor about tighten up the IRAs. The clamor was on the other side about, oh, more. And as you'll see in the list in my testimony, the IRAs, I recall, was about a $24 billion pickup. Well, in the Senate, on the Senate floor, this IRA amendment came up, and I won it 51-48. And 19 out of the 20 oily senators voted with me. And had I not made that deal, I would have lost a couple of them. And had I lost a couple, I'd lose IRA, and that loses the bill.
Senator Bradley?
The reality is that tax reform was failing until the Packwood counteroffensive. And it wasn't like this just sprung forth from the head of Zeus, right? We had 30 hearings. The substance had been thoroughly chewed over by the committee, so it was familiar territory. It was just put together in a different way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Senator Thune. No, wait a minute. Let me just see here. No, I'm sorry. Senator Menendez first.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you both for your testimony, which I read at length. I think we all agree we need to simplify the tax code and make it more economically efficient. But I always think that before we go about the task of comprehensive tax reform, we need to agree what is the end goals that we're trying to achieve so that we can direct our focus. And I mean, I know that some of my friends here argue that we should focus solely on corporate tax reform and profits and stock market gains, and I think I've heard you both say that you really need to do it all at the end of the day in order to make it effective. Senator Bradley, do you believe it's enough for tax reform to be focused on increasing GDP, on the stock market, on corporate profits, or should we also have the goal of ensuring economic growth as part of it, particularly as it's felt by as many Americans as possible? Is that the type of goal we should be looking forward to?
Yeah, I mean, you want the economy to grow, and you want everybody to benefit from that. And when we did this bill, as I said earlier, we had 4 principles. These are the things you should consider. that the market's a more efficient allocator of resources than we are, or the Ways and Means Committee of Finance is, figuring out we ought to do this activity or that activity. Second, equal incomes should pay equal tax. It's not fair to have your neighbor pay less because they have a particular tax benefit. And third, those who have more should pay more, the progressive principle. And fourth, if you can simplify it, please simplify it. To me, those are the four principles. The economic issues, economic growth, obviously progressivity would say you'd want people to move up. And you'd want to say to people at the top, you have to pay a little bit more. So I think those are the principles that I would use going forward.
You know, I think that it's, you know, my question suggests, at least I view it, that it's not an either-or proposition. In fact, fairness and equity in the code actually help reduce the burden on low and middle class working families. Is not only morally desirable, but economically good policy, because about 2/3 of our economy is fueled by consumer spending, and certainly low and middle income class families have a higher percentage of their income that they need and spend on goods and services. In that respect, I think that it makes eminent sense to be looking at how we deal, how the consequences of reform deal with them, not just on the corporate taxes as well, because I think it will fuel spending that will help, you know, private sector profits. Senator Packwood, at the end of your testimony, you included a statistic that in 1983, at least 1,900 people who earned $1 million or more paid no federal tax. And that fact was due to a myriad of special interest loopholes that were clogging the arteries of the tax code before '86. And as you noted in your testimony, the product that passed the Finance Committee 20-0 and would later become law raised the taxes significantly on corporations and rich individuals. They would pay more, middle income and the poor would pay less. So we've had now a situation in which the average New Jersey family that makes $65,000 per year pays a higher rate than the wealthiest 400 Americans that make an average of about $270 million per year. So from your experience, what impact does inequity have on the public's perception of the tax code fairness? And would you agree that a focus of reform should be to eliminate the loopholes and preferential rates that have allowed the wealthiest to steadily reduce their effective tax rate over the past 30 years?
There's no question that the public is aware of the inequality. As I say, in 1986 they weren't, and the issue was fairness. How do these people avoid paying any tax at all? Or how do major corporations that are making profits in the defense industry get money back? And that just irritated everybody, and that was a driving goal for us. Inequality today is obviously a much higher goal, preference, issue than it was 30 years ago. What I'm hesitant about is not do you want to fix that. The longer I've been in life and the longer I was in the Senate, the less confident I was that what we were going to do would necessarily get us to what we wanted. And that's why I agree with Bill. The market is a better allocation. If you want to somehow undo the inequality, I think that is legislatively doable. If you can get both sides to agree on that, that is perfect. But it wasn't what drove us in 1986.
And
Thank you.
I might say that,
I'm sorry, Bill.
you know, in terms of the middle class, I mean, we need good-paying jobs, more good-paying jobs. And so that's tough to get at through the tax code, but not impossible. So I'll share with you one of my hobby horses. Infrastructure investment, desperately needed. Tough budget, you can't do it at the size that we'd like to do it. But there are people that have money. Chinese, Singaporeans, Koreans, in the Persian Gulf, large sovereign funds. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. And they have to decide what do they do with that money. And I ask any number of them, why don't you invest in infrastructure in the United States? In other words, they play the role the British played in the 19th century. And they say, well, there's this one provision in the tax code.
892.
And the provision of the tax code is section 892.
Yep.
And that says that if you're a foreign government and you invest in stocks or bonds, you don't pay tax on that. Very simple. Extend that to infrastructure. And you could very well find a significant amount of money for infrastructure coming from sovereign funds.
Thank you.
Great. Senator Thune?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for being here. I was a staffer back in 86 when this was done last time, and a great admirer of the hard work that went into it and the ultimate result. There are some things that are very different. It's a different time. I think this is a different place probably than it was back then. And the one thing you already noted too that I think really made a difference was the involvement, active engagement of the President in the process. Remember Treasury 1 and Treasury 2, the big books that they sent up here, and how hard they worked to try and get that across the finish line. And that to me seems like to do anything really big and consequential in this town, you really need presidential leadership. So I hope that we'll get that. I just want a couple of quick questions with regard to a couple of the issues that you batted around back at that time. One had to do with whether lower rates or more favorable cost recovery provisions ought to be the focus of tax reform, and which of the approaches is better for economic growth. And I think that was a part of the debate. And the question, I guess, is do you believe lower rates paired with longer depreciation schedules was the right policy choice? And how do you suggest we ought to approach that question today?
Don't know how you ought to appropriate today. We clearly felt that lower rates were the most desirable thing we were doing. Depreciation was a major difference in interest between the House and the Senate on that when we had to go to conference. But I'm not going to advise you as to what you ought to do on this. I just say lower rates. In my mind, I'd keep it revenue neutral, but as I say, there might be something you can work out on that to even increase revenues. But lower rates would be what would drive me.
How about the issue of cap gains at the time going at the same rate as ordinary income, and we've since then gone back to a differential? What do you think about that? In your view, as you look back on it, was that a good thing?
Well, I remember, yes, I think it was. And I remember Bill talking just a moment ago about the hearings we had, and that fellow that would say you had to have a differential. If it was 30%, had to be 15, and if it was 20%, had to be 10. So I asked him, I said, if there was no income tax, would you have to have a subsidy to invest? Because there's no differential. And he had never been asked that question, didn't know how to answer it. But I think you could do very well if you have a low rate with capital gains being the same rate.
Okay. And this has been alluded to a little bit already today too, but there's been some discussion about what are the goals of tax reform. And one of the things I think that separates us here, which makes it kind of hard, is that there are folks who look at this as an exercise to raise revenue. That's something the President obviously wants to do. A lot of us believe that the best way to get revenue is through greater growth, and that tax reform, a goal of tax reform ought to be how do we generate economic growth in the economy, which lifts everybody's boats and addresses a lot of those income disparity issues that were mentioned earlier as well. So speak a little bit about growth as an objective, a goal of tax reform, and how you think that plays into the deliberations that should occur here.
Well, growth, obviously, everybody wants growth. But I remember Russell Long, who was chairman of this committee for 16, 17 years, in one meeting going, I have been here, he came here in 94, I have been here for 30 years. He says, 3 times we have put the investment tax credit in tax reform. 3 times we've taken it out in tax reform. Now you tell me when it's reforming, when does it work to help the economy? I think a lot of us don't know exactly what works. Yeah, I do know there are all kinds of industries that want things who say this will work, but I don't think we're necessarily smart enough to know.
Senator Bradley, you've talked a lot about growth. Tell me your sort of views on that.
Well, I think you can have growth and equity. I think growth you get in part through the lower rates, but also in part from clearing out the code of all of this underbrush that prevents the economy from growing because it subsidizes one segment as opposed to another. I think that if you're going to deal with the equity question, I think the way to do that is with the earned income tax credit. I think the president's proposal on second earner credit is pretty interesting. I mean, you can do things in the code that are structural, that are not special interests, that will allow you to deal with equity. At the same time, you're lowering the overall rate. And to me, that's the key.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator Bradley, you're a credit to basketball players everywhere, so thanks for your...
It's a big compliment from you, Senator.
Yeah, right.
Okay, Senator Scott, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here today with us and providing us insight from 1986 and how you brought together what at times seemed to be impossible. And I will tell you that sitting here as a relatively new senator, it seems relatively impossible for the two sides to come together as well. So your insight has been valuable to all of us. And I just for point of reference, I think this is Treasury 2 and this is Treasury 1 during the years that you guys found the will to make things happen, and these are about 6 years of the president's proposals. My first question really for both of y'all is how do we find common ground when finding a serious partner towards real tax reform appears to be missing in the seriousness of the presentations and the proposals, number one. And the second part of that is when we've heard from both our chairman, Senator Hatch, and Senator Thune just talked about revenue neutral position. When you start the conversation as well, talking about achieving several $100 billion more of revenue versus a position of neutrality, how do we bridge that chasm?
I don't think Bill and I can tell you how to bridge that gap. If the positions are irrevocable, revenue, no revenue, that gap cannot be bridged.
I kind of agree.
And, if you can't bridge that, then spend some time doing something else. I think, however, that the question is, can you put together a small group of people on this committee that have sufficient clout within the committee, as Bob said earlier, that you could actually, if you chose, spend the time to come up with something that was pretty good. I mean, you know, more taxes. You have to figure out which taxes, the trade-offs that I offered with the consumption tax versus cutting the Social Security and employment taxes. That's not something we're going to decide. That's something that you have to decide. And as I said earlier, all I know is when you're in that room with 7 people and you're making votes and doing things and affecting this part of the economy, and that's a lot of fun. If you're just coming in and having your two sides make your statements, that can't be too much fun.
Can't be too much fun is correct. Looking for other things to do with our time. So I thought about playing basketball, but I'm too short and built for football. So good news is Senator Hatch, on the other hand, has taken a fairly inventive and creative approach to making sure that we find some common ground working across the aisle and looking for sweet spots. And he's put together some working groups that I think may be very beneficial going forward. One of the areas that I have great passion and interest as an entrepreneur for the last 15 years is why simplification of the tax code actually benefits all. I think, Senator Bradley, you said that tax loopholes are ways for politicians to spend money without having to go through the appropriations process. And the more opportunities that politicians have to spend money without going through the appropriations process, the more complicated and difficult the tax code comes. When I started my business, I will tell you that I didn't think about loopholes as it relates to starting a business. I thought about creating jobs and making a profit and changing the lives of family members and employees. I would love to hear you chat just a little bit about the notion of simplification. Either of you, esteemed gentlemen, talk about the notion of simplification and the natural outcome of allowing money to find its best place through the private sector?
You know, when I was speaking about this every day for 4 years, I went on the David Letterman show. That's when he was late. And I took out a card and said, you ought to be able to do your income tax on this card. Now, that's not quite true, but we do know the vast number of Americans have income from wages, interest, or dividends. Guess who has all that information other than the individuals? The IRS. The IRS, for bulk of Americans, could do the return based on that, send it to the people, and the people could either sign it or they could say, no, I want to have another accountant do it. That would be a dramatic simplification.
Well, in 1986, I had a younger person on the Joint Tax Committee who's gone, I can't remember who it was now, give me just a ballpark estimate, not spend time running on what you could do with a flat tax, which is certainly simple. And he said at that time, took him a few days, you could have a flat tax, this individual side, 11%, and raise the same amount of money that we're now raising. But of course, that meant that a widow with 2 kids who paid no taxes would now pay $1,100 in taxes. So I said, what about if you exempt all families of 4 under $30,000, just exempt them? He came back a couple of days, he says, 19%, but it slightly tilts toward the rich. And I was curious about slightly. He said, well, you realize that when you're going to get rid of every deduction that mankind conceivably has, you're mainly talking about people with the rich, not the poor. So Sally, who works at the mill, who fills out a 1040 EZ and doesn't have any deductions, is not adversely affected. He said, but I think if 19% would be the norm, you could keep the same progressivity and do it at around 17% on the low end, 20% middle, and around 23% on the top. Now, this is a top-of-the-head thought of his, but it's worth running if you want to see what you could do. And then, Senator, you have got a simple tax. How much did you earn? You're in the 20% tax bracket. You don't get any deductions. That's simple.
That's interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator White, by the way, we've had over 30 hearings on this over the last 4 years.
Before you, I do want to tell this one quick story about Bill because it was cute.
Sure.
The President signed the bill. Signing ceremonies.
I was going to say that, too.
Signing ceremony is going to be, say, on a Wednesday. Bill is in Portland at a noontime luncheon, a fundraiser for a Democratic candidate for governor, and then he's going to catch the plane back for the signing ceremony. My campaign manager is a tough woman. She says, you're up for election this year. You're not going back. You won't get any publicity back there anyway. But Bill was going. Well, Portland is socked in. You can't get a plane out in the afternoon. He calls Seattle. Can I drive to Seattle and get a plane out? No. Can I get a charter plane to San Francisco? Nothing's flying out. And so, and I was having a press conference the next day at 7:30, and the president was going to call me after he finished signing. I said, well, Bill, we have a press conference tomorrow morning if you'd like to come. And he said, no, I'm going to get out. Early the next morning, he calls my hotel and says, where is that press conference? And he comes, and the president talks to me, and then I said, well, and the local network affiliates are there. And the president talks to me, and I chat a bit, and I said, by the way, Mr. President, Bill Bradley is here, and you know how valuable he was for us on this. I wonder if you could say a few words to him. So he comes on, he speaks to Bill. Now, the thing that irritates me, he makes national television from appearing on the local affiliate in Portland, and I don't get covered nationwide.
Well, the more relevant point is it was because of my respect for Bob Packwood that I decided in the middle of his campaign to join him in a press conference about tax reform. I think that's probably not happened a lot recently.
Oh, that was well done.
Well, I have a lot of respect for both of you. You've both been great senators, and you both have done an awful lot for this country, and we're very proud of it. Senator Wyden has
I'm going to be very brief, and thank you both for that simplicity discussion, because, you know, I've thought for a long time that this insanely complicated tax code plays right into the hands of the special interests and the lobbyists. And it's going to be even more challenging today than it was in '86. You know, we've been talking about Gucci Gulch, and there are these wonderful descriptions in Gucci Gulch about the lobbyists who would wait in line outside the Ways and Means room for a phone booth. Well, today, a lobbyist is going to sit in the back of the room and set in motion a tweet that is, in effect, probably going to go to millions. Maybe they're going to be able to tweet directly to millions from the back of the room. So simplicity is going to be hugely important, and I think there's some contenders for how to do it, and Senator Bradley mentioned one in his testimony with respect to the information that the IRS, in effect, has in giving the citizen an option of, in effect, having the IRS mail something. Wouldn't be required. It would just be an option. The postcard, concept, in effect, you can almost put a tax return on the back of a W-2, and that is something worth exploring. I'm also interested in looking, we'll be following up with the two of you on the idea that if you triple the standard deduction, and a number of senators of both political parties are interested in a significant increase in the standard deduction, you don't have so many people itemized. So that's another possibility. But just know we're going to follow up with you on the simplicity issue. I want to wrap up with one last question, and that is there one thing you regret about what happened in '86 and you would counsel us in terms of what to do for the future? In other words, it's always easy to kind of think about what's possible, today in the abstract. But you two went through it. Anything you regret and you'd like us to change? I know that one thing that I regret about '86, and I was just a junior congressperson, is Senator Bradley's right when he says no current Congress can permanently bind a future Congress from unraveling it, but you can make it really hard. I mean, you can put people through multiple votes and the like. So I can think of some things, but you two went through it. Anything you regret, one thing that you'd tell us to be careful about?
Well, I regret the odious deal I had to make with the oilies, which was totally unjustified and given to them, and no other business got it, but I needed their votes on the floor. And what they wanted didn't cost very much money. And the IRAs were $24 billion. But do I wish I didn't have to put that in? You're right. But that's one of those decisions you make on the spur of the moment. I made it the night we were doing the final markup, and I didn't bounce it off my group of 6 because I knew they'd vote against it. So I'd rather just put it in and have them mad than have them vote on it and put it in and think I've double-crossed them.
Sir Bradley?
So even in this world of great equality among senators, among the group of 7 that Senator Packwood talked about, there was still the chairman's prerogative. And I think that's what that was. Nobody questioned that because we'd been through the whole process. Do I regret anything? I regret that the bill lasted only a short period of time. As I said, it was a humbling experience, sandcastles at the edge of the ocean, and only a commitment from members of this committee and from presidents, succeeding presidents. I mean, President Clinton had a totally different idea of taxes. He'd like to spend through the tax code, and therefore that helped unravel. The differential capital gains came back. We no longer treated capital and labor the same, which is what we did. Rate went up to 39. There were infinite numbers of hiding places for little provisions. My favorite being the one that says if you rent your house for 2 weeks, you pay no tax on that income. There was once a senator from Georgia on this committee who had a lot of friends that had the Masters golf tournament. They had big houses around the Masters golf tournament. These things happen, right? But I don't regret that. That was before my time. But I do think that you have to find some way. I regret that it didn't last. That's what I say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thanks to both of you. Senator Packwood, you have one of your top staffers, or at least one I know of, who was with you at the time You care to introduce?
Bill?
Yeah.
Bill Diefendorfer, stand up.
Barely can, sir.
That's what tax reform does.
Bill was the chief of staff of the Finance Committee at the time, and I've often said that bill wasn't my bill, this was our bill. He was absolutely critical in this, and especially critical in dealing with the administration and with Dick Darman. But it would not have passed but for him.
And I agree with that.
He's still legendary. I want to thank both of you. This means a lot to me personally, and I've admired both of you for a long time as premier legislators, as people who really care for people, and who both are extremely intelligent. So this has meant a lot to me, and I appreciate it. And with that, we'll recess until further notice.
Thank you.
To a page.
Witness present. But I'll forward you.
I'm on it now, but I wouldn't have had anything that was out there.
And you can watch this hearing anytime on our website, cspan.org. More tax news this morning with The Hill and its online article. The Obama administration refusing to publicly release